Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Now, I've been playing at a cutting edge level since Siege of Orgrimmar, and I haven't really seen anybody make a video or talk enough about the topic of how you use players' health, including your own, to be able to make the decisions in terms of who you heal. There's a lot of times where high-level players are making small, micro decisions in terms of how they're healing, who they're healing, what resources that they're using to top their allies that make a really big difference in their performance as they get into higher level content. It also just kind of helps for how you survive dealing with the unexpected nature of pug groups. So in this video, we're going to talk about how players' health, their defensive value, and the mechanics and the damage that's coming out in rating and Mythic Plus is going to affect your decision making and how you can augment those decisions depending on the environment that you're in. Now, first and foremost, of course, there's triage, right? There is healing the lowest health ally whenever there's damage going out. It's the general priority of the person who's lowest in health is in the highest need of support because they're more liable to die. That is true sometimes, but with this Mythic Plus season in particular, we've moved away from having a lot of party-wide AoE. You could think of Season 1, things like Ruby Life Pools, where it's just like every single thing is nice, even chunks of damage out onto everyone. Now that still exists in some areas, but it is not nearly as prevalent as single target damage, which means you need to just bomb healing into your allies to make sure that they stay alive. What this means is that certain moments are going to affect your decision making, whether it's healing other DPS, yourself, or the tank. One of the biggest things this season is bear druids are insanely tanky and survivable, but what you can really notice early on is it's almost like body language, where you can see, and if the more that you watch a tank and watch how they play and how they set up for pulls, especially when you play with enough of them, you can start seeing who is building towards mitigation or has a very strong mastery of their spec to not really need a lot of healing as a tank. And then there's other times you might play with an off-meta tank, you may play with somebody who's not as comfortable, and they're going to need a lot of healing. And so you might end up getting into some boss fights or some difficult trash pulls where you're going to have the boss into trash, and as a result of this, you're going to actually need to prioritize the tank in terms of the healing a lot more. Other times, you're going to have certain instances where there is party-wide AoE damage. Something like Freehold sort of comes to mind, where the AoE shout will come out on the side of Freehold, but that can also be outranged by players. And so there's moments where you don't need to heal those ranged players right away, and instead need to be healing, yourself or the tank or somebody else as a result. I think the easiest way to be able to highlight this is definitely with a fight like Ziskarn, where there's the elimination protocol, and then there's also the knockback, which is dealing the damage over time. When you have players that are not affected by elimination protocol, the circles that you have onto you, nobody's really taking any damage. And as a result, there's times where the dot from the knockback sort of fades, and somebody could be very low health, but you have to watch the damage ticking on players with things like elimination protocol to make sure that they're going to be able to properly survive that incoming damage, because not only is it a damage over time, but it's also a burst of damage at the end as the fire line shoots from the boss into that player. And so ignoring certain players and watching debuffs makes a profound difference in how you're prioritizing your abilities, because you might not cast that Prayer of Healing or might not cast that AoE heal and instead cast what are really inefficient single target heals just because somebody could bleed out by 5% and a single target heal would have saved them if you made the decision correctly. This also stands out in areas where you begin your AoE heals by casting onto afflicted players. Abilities like Chain Heal, which hit the hardest, or at least they used to, on their primary target, are always going to be a high priority to make sure that you're casting that AoE ability onto the debuff player when even mass AoE goes out, because you're making sure that even though everyone's taking equal damage at the start, you're prioritizing that target with the afflicted debuff to make sure that they're always going to be receiving some of that AoE healing, and they're not going to get sort of like wombo comboed whenever they're low health and die as a result from the debuff that they have. Now, those areas can often be pretty simple, but there's also areas where players are always in like a rush. And especially when you get into cutting edge progression, I know there's a lot of guilds right now who are working on mythic bosses, and I've had a number of coaching sessions where players are working on Neltharion, or they're working on Sarkareth, or they're working on Rashok. And you get into a number of these sort of like dead air moments where you're almost at the end of the fight or about at the end of the fight, but the boss has just significantly higher health than should be to be able to push the next phase or just to beat the enrage. And as a result, you just kind of chain wipe, chain wipe, chain wipe. And while healer damage isn't always going to be the difference between, 5% of boss's health at the end of the fight, it can be very significant when you're starting to hit those lower percentage points. And there's a lot of times where I notice that healers don't really look to add the damage. And you notice it a lot of different times. The Skarn's a great example. Even early phases, the second phase, I should say, of Sarkareth and the beginning of the final phase for Neltharion, where there are these 20, 30-second stretches of time, maybe even more on the case of Sarkareth, where nothing really is happening. In the case of Sark, you'll have moments of mass AoE, where, a cast went off from like one of the ads in phase 2, or there was the knockback that happened, and players are instantly like rushing to churn out as much healing as they possibly can, and not only like using a quick spell, but also casting, in the case of a Holy Priest, casting all their Sanctifies, but also adding multiple Prayer of Healings as quick as they possibly can. But the threat of the damage has already passed after those casts go through, after the ads die, and there's a lot of moments where just casting those Sanctifies is plenty. There's players just casting their efficient heals and letting, Efflorescence, Healing Rain, whatever AoEs that are natural and efficient going off to be able to finish topping off players is sufficient to then allow you to continue adding damage in this phase so that your team has a much more comfortable time later on in the encounter, because on Sarkareth, all of your damage matters a very, very large amount. While there's moments that there's going to be mass AoE happening for the entire party all at the same time, again, whether it's Raids or Mythic Plus, there's also moments that there's very large disparities in defensive strength. Anybody can tell you that there's a lot of specs in the game that are not tanky at all. Usually, healers are going to be built a little bit tankier when it comes to dungeons than it will for DPS. That is noted by like all healers running the Spore Cloak, for example, as their embellishment. And a lot of times, DPS don't like running their Spore Cloak unless they're in insanely high keys where they have to in order to survive. So whenever you're going into a pug group and you notice that DPS don't run Spore Cloak, or DPS are not spec'd into certain defensives, if you're looking at your Omni CD, those are things to sort of keep in the back of your mind, that you are going to have a greater amount of investment in healing that person when equal damage is going out onto the party. Certain weak auras you can use, for example, to track your own Spore Cloak cooldown, as well as tracking your own health pot, health stone, and leaning on those abilities to be able to act as defensives. For example, if you're going to be having even ticking damage from like a third boss of Halls of Infusion, or you're having burst damage coming out on the Forge Master Gorek and Neltharis, there's burst damage all over the place, or there's steady damage, but it's hitting everybody equally. As a result of this, you may not be healing every single person at the same exact time, and because of this, you can avoid healing yourself and just burn a health pot instead. You can prioritize healing somebody else while putting a defensive on a third player, so that way you don't have to worry about them at all. Ward of Faceless Ire is a very good example of this, so that if you have burst damage going out, you can put the ward on one player and ignore them for the burst damage, and just let, passive AoE heals hit them, while prioritizing some other player to be able to receive the majority of the healing that you have going out. How you make those decisions is always going to be very important, and it's influenced by other players' defensives, your own healing profile that you're going to have access to, whether you have a burst of AoE or you're going to be more single target, more prio target, or looking at things like cheat deaths and like what is actually available. I noticed when I did the original Mage Tower challenge, or I guess the revamped version of it, that they did for Shadowlands, it was immensely difficult because there were multiple moments of heavy burst damage and the healer's strength was extremely low. As a result of this, I literally could not top off my allies in the first phase of this challenge, in the first iteration of it, really, when it came back in Shadowlands, because healers were so weak in this challenge and the damage was so insanely high. They've nerfed it, 5 or 6 times since this point, but it's a really good example in terms of how you prioritize your allies and how you protect your allies from incoming damage. Some of the notable things for this encounter or this challenge were fixates, where only one player would be taking damage. There would be single target nuke casts that you could interrupt, or use crowd control, or you could use purge effects to reduce the damage of it. And watching who is being targeted with each cast can influence your decision. There's mass AoEs as well from the Fan of Knives that the rogues would cast in the encounter as well. And so with single target, mass AoE, and different levels of defensive power from those NPCs, you had to really use every NPC's health pool in your own as resources in your toolkit to influence the decision making to make sure that the person at greatest risk of death is going to be prioritized. If you've never done this challenge before, if one person dies, one of the NPCs dies, the challenge is immediately over. And so there are various moments where AoE was going out and I'm trying to keep everybody at 10 or 20% just so that they're healthy enough until they kill off the ad and I have time to top players off. Or moments where I leave the NPC allies at 40% health because I'm bombing healing into the tank who's getting fixated and taking tons of damage from the caster. All of those decisions have to be built off of the back of the greatest threat, your ally's defensive strength, and the resources that you have in your toolbox to be able to get the most threatened ally, not the lowest health ally, but the most threatened ally into a safe position so that they can survive and continue on throughout the encounter. This is probably one of the hardest decision-making processes that like I mentioned, for healers out there, and it's extremely, extremely challenging to be able to do it because you just have to be able to learn what the damage patterns are going to be throwing at you, and this is something that is going to really transcend a lot of WoW expansions. You'll see footage here from Sanguine Depths and Shadowlands, the Mage Tower, current Mythic boss fights. Wherever you go, keeping in mind not only the damage that's taken, the future damage that's taken, and the defensive power and healing power of yourself and your allies, all of these influence your decisions to whether you add damage, to where you single target heal, even if it's inefficient, to whether you just mass AoE heal, who you target when you're healing. All of these help make you a stronger healer, keeping in mind the threat, and also keeping in mind off-healing this expansion, whether it's Breath of Eons, which is creating shields for allies, Vamp Embrace, Vigil, AG. I know there's a lot of nerfs coming in for them, but even in their nerfed forms, they give you a cushion so that you can provide more damage or more healing to somebody who's at great risk, and then you're going to be able to ignore other allies who are going to be more self-sustaining. Keep these things in mind whether it's in your raids or dungeons, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more content. Big love to our patrons. If you'd like to join them, linked in the description down below, and if you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments as well.